Tower 30, what do you want?
Tower 30, good afternoon, clear to land, runway 24, wind check, 290 degrees, 19 knots. TWA 881, tower line up and wait, runway 24. Hello and welcome to this, for me, very special and personal episode from Irish Skies Pod. As I look back from early January 1984 to late September 2025, over my 41 years, 2 months, 2 weeks and 5 days of being involved in air traffic control at Shannon. Many of the photographs used in this video have previously been published in annual reports, etc., and many are from my own personal collection. And once again, I'd like to thank all the aircraft spotters and the photographers who've captured aviation history across the years and have permitted me to use their material. A few days ago on 17th of September 2025, the curtain came down on the chapter in the story which began on the 11th of January 1984, when the Irish Civil Service Commission advertised for jobs as air traffic control assistants with a starting salary of £5,740 or £110 a week. However, the prologue started many years before that on the balcony of Dublin Airport and out by Forest Little near the runway 24 threshold, watching planes coming and going, not to mention many hours spent in the cockpit of Echo India Alpha Oscar Hotel, when the Viscount, along with the Uller, was the centrepiece of the Dublin Airport Museum. At home as kids we had airband radios, and I loved listening to the transmissions between ATC and the pilots. I especially loved the old top-down for the PAR approach. The departure run off Dublin's runway 24 was visible from our home on Willow Park Road, and I loved seeing the departures of 737s, Tridents, 111s, and one of my favourites, the Scandinavian Caravels. We were members of the Aviation Society of Ireland and tagged the overflights with full procedural reports being given. Clipper 1, reporting Liffey 1027, flight level 310, Dublin at 1032, and Eagle next. I wasn't a great one for school, but the 11 o'clock departure by the Shamrock 105, accompanied by the grinding noise of the then huge Pratt & Whitney engines, was a very memorable sound from my youth, and seeing it take off every school day was a great distraction from Mr. Summers' class on the top floor of Our Lady of Victory's Primary School on Ballymun Avenue. And so when the advert came out for the job, I got my application in and through a neighbour met up with Nullig O'Mailon, who was a supervisor in Dublin ATC. The assistant or ATCA grade was intended to be a recruitment grade, and like an apprenticeship, the ATCA would work alongside the controllers, processing the flight plans and learning the trade before progressing onto the controller positions. However, in early 1980s Ireland, there was a recession and there was a glut of assistants in the system, who because of government cutbacks and embargoes on promotion, had not been promoted to controllers, despite there being growth in our traffic, especially from the US to Europe after the oil crisis of the 1970s. This meant that there was a lot of discontent amongst the ATCAs who were being held within this recruitment grade, not to mention the reduced income that they were on, and so Nullig's advice was not to take the job. Despite Nullig's warnings, I did take the job. I was only 18 and I just wanted to be working in or near the airport, and I reckoned if things were really bad within the ATCA grade, it could be easier to get a job when you already had another one. And so I was instructed to report to Shannon ATC on Wednesday the 11th of July 1984 at 11 o'clock. I travelled down the day before on a route I would become very familiar with, from Euston Station via Limerick Junction to Limerick and on the bus out to Shannon. The following morning I set off walking from Corrib Drive, up by Drumgeely, Shannon Executive, SRS and the old airport police box outside Wing 5, and onwards to the tower, where we were introduced to Des Eglinton and Ned Chambers, the CATCO and SATCO respectively. 3 others joined with me that day, Brendan Bruton, Maura O'Reilly and Damien Glennon, and a couple of months later we were joined by Helen McCarthy. We spent that summer in the Kincora apartments before moving to Dunanore for a number of years, and these years were filled with many, many happy memories. We all seemed to gel together, and very importantly, there was no messing around with the household finances. Everyone contributed and nobody ever dipped a kitty, and so over 40 years on, we're still all talking to each other. I was assigned to low-level and tower duties, and it certainly was not the high-tech environment that somebody might imagine. Low-level and approach operated off a single primary radar head, and the room was darkened with strip lights above the procedural board alongside the radar controller. Accompanying the clunk of the analogue clocks every 30 seconds was the constant click-clack of the teleprinter machines that carried the AFTN messages, and every message received had to be manually logged and processed by the ATGH. First of all, the AFTN and aviation language had to be learned, and a flight progress strip had to be written up for each and every flight plan. The type of strip was determined by the direction of flight, east, west, and whether the flight was arriving or departing or overflying the airspace. And believe you me, it was very quickly that the performance bands of the various aircraft type became well known, and as I said, like an apprentice, through repetition. Back in those days, there was a huge array of aircraft types operating, and a huge array of performances. And there was modern aircraft mixing in with the now converted cargo aircraft such as the Argosy, the Herald and the Vanguard or Merchantman. Accusations of Cold War technological espionage were rife, with Eastern and Western companies producing similar looking aircraft, like the Tupolev 154, the Boeing 727 and the Hawker Siddeley Trident. Likewise, the DC-9, BAC 111 and the Tupolev 134, the VC-10 and the IL-62, and not to mention Concorde and the Tupolev 144 Concordsky. However, throughout my career, my favourite two aircraft have been the Concorde and the Queen of the Skies, the 747. Before the development of the present-day aircraft simulators, Shannon was widely used by many airlines for training flights. And right through the 1980s and 90s, there was a schedule to allow 3, or if line traffic was very quiet and the weather was wide open, 4 jetliners might be allowed into the circuit. Without a radar feed in the tower or SSR in approach, the identification of the aircraft for the controllers was maintained by visual reference combined with the movement of the flight strips, and the tower assistant was also expected to maintain situational awareness. The upper airspace did have secondary radar, but this equipment was showing its age. The SSR showed only the aircraft ID and flight level. There was no electronic transfer of flight data from one centre to another, and each and every flight plan that came in on the AFTM printers had to be manually prepared on the flight strip, and the subsequent estimate to or from London or Prestwick had to be passed via telephone, and this was obviously very labour intensive. Ironically, 10 mile separation was mandated in the SSR system, but the Dublin and Shannon low-level controllers, if they were brave or silly enough, needed to apply only 5 mile separation on primary radar. In Ireland, responsibility for the Marine Rescue Co-Ordination Centre had rested with the Irish Naval Service at Haulbowline. However, in the late 1960s, due to severe staff shortages, the Irish Naval Services requested to be relieved of this MRCC responsibility. It might seem unusual that responsibility for the MRCC would transfer to the Air Traffic Control Service, but a deciding factor in the government decision would appear to be the major air and sea rescue and recovery operation as a result of the crash of Aer Lingus Viscount Shamrock 712 off the Irish southeast coast in March 1968. With both aviation and marine assets in use, the desirability of a small island state having a single coordination authority was demonstrated, and Shannon ATC assumed the national MRCC role from 1971.
This here is our area of responsibility, the Shannon SRR, Shannon Search and Rescue Region, and it covers an area of 90,000 square miles. 60,000 of that would be underwater and 30,000 under land.
I worked in the AIS and MRCC from 1986 onwards, and I loved working there as I was teamed with Mick Griffin, who was brilliant as a trainer and as a senior man. The MRCC role was not just to provide assistance to major air and sea rescues. Essentially, the MRCC operated the Coast Guard role in receiving all marine emergency calls for everything from beach swimmers in distress to overdue small boats to fishing vessels or crew in need of emergency services. the MRCC controller and assistant were equipped with just telephones, a telex, an AFTN, and later a fax to communicate with the outside world. MRCC Shannon would then organise the appropriate local coast life-saving services, the RNLI lifeboats, and if required, SAR helicopters and our fixed-wing aircraft to assist the person or people in distress, and direct the search and rescue assets until such time as an on-scene coordinator could be appointed or the mission was completed. While the Irish coastline kept the MRCC staff busy, a number of incidents such as the Betelgeuse oil tanker explosion in Bantry 1979, the Fastnet race disaster off the Cork coast in August of 1979, the sinking of the Kowloon Bridge in December 1986, and the tragic loss of Air India 182 off the southwest coast in June 1985, put the MRCC Shannon and its staff into the international headlines.
Shortly after 8 o'clock this morning, Air India Flight 182 contacted Shannon the normal way on reaching the Shannon boundary. It was cleared to London at flight level 310, 31,000 feet. But 5-6 minutes later, the radar controller observed that the aircraft was no longer on the radar screen. And every effort at that stage to establish communications with it were unsuccessful. 2 aircraft in the vicinity were called, contacted, and they could neither establish communication with it or indeed any visual contact. And a full-scale search and rescue mission was organised at that particular stage.
Co-located with the MRCC was the AIS for issuing NOTAMs, creating flight plans and preparing flight briefings for crews. Again, equipment was minimal, not to mention manual, and one of our biggest fears in flight planning was missing an airspace address for flights going behind the Iron Curtain or entering the Berlin corridors. The airspace of Eastern Europe was totally different to how it is nowadays. However, we all knew the stories, whether they were urban myths or otherwise, of flights that had to divert due to incorrect flight planning and addressing, having been denied entry into the Eastern European airspace. And of course, the authorities would always hunt down whoever the flight planner was. 18 months into our careers, our first assessed controllers course was non-radar procedural control, working the lower Shannon airspace combined with Shannon Airport approach. VOR, NDB, vertical and time separations, not to mention the 45-degree sector for separation between arrivals and departures, needed to be learned and implemented. But for some reason, I just loved the ballet of procedural control. The required knowledge of the VOR radials on the various routes, the crossing radials from a second VOR to ensure that 2 aircraft were separated from each other, and how all this information was transferred onto the flight progress strip to develop a mental picture of where each aircraft was in your airspace and in relation to one another. The use of procedural separation taught me a few good tricks of the trade that have stood to me throughout my career, even up to and including the most sophisticated equipment that we use today. As time has progressed, companies and airliners have changed, as this photograph from Gatwick in the 1980s shows an array of airlines that no longer exist, while at the same time, 2 upstarts that will become very familiar to us were trying to break into the market. Shannon, of course, was a huge base for Aeroflot, and during the 1980s, a barter deal was done, whereby the landing and handling charges were bartered against Russian aviation fuel, which was tankered by sea to the airport jetty and the fuel farm. This fuel was then sold through an Irish company to the other users of Shannon Airport. And you got to remember that many of these operators were American, and that this was at the height of the Cold War. The social scene in Shannon centred around the Shannon Nights, and to a lesser extent the Crossroads, with many excursions to Nelly's and Fibbers in Bunratty, and the infamous Hoagie's nightclub. Sports helped me settle in, and through the Shannon ATC soccer team and the airport interfirm competition, I met with Mick Behan of Telecom Éireann, who was over the airport team itself. The airport team played in the wider Shannon Town interfirm competition, which was a big affair back then. I transferred from my GAA club in Dublin to Wolfe Towns in Shannon, and I always remembered how people like Paddy Carrick and Jim O'Sullivan welcomed me into the club, while on the basketball front, Paul Ferguson had everything well organised for us. Through Mick Behan, I was contacted by Donald McGee, who at the time was over Rhine Rovers in Quinn, and started playing soccer out there. Rhine Rovers was great, and I was treated very well by guys like Mike Kelly, the O'Halloran brothers, the Ryan brothers, Mike McNamara, Tom O'Sullivan, Julian Crimmins, Martin Chambers, and other blow-ins like Jerry Morta and Eugene Moynihan. And I played there for a good few years, and the Rovers also later welcomed 2 more ATC colleagues into the club. Before the 1995 season, I transferred over to Newmarket Celtic in the Premier Division under Derek Douglas, and again was welcomed into the club by the locals. I loved the training and the commitment, and thankfully I managed to generate one favourable headline during my time there. I was also very proud to be selected to play Oscar trainer for Clare, though unfortunately we weren't as successful as other Clare teams that followed on. Anyways, back to the work stuff. Thankfully we were not trapped for too long in the ACA grade and progressed into high-level procedural, then tower, high-level radar and subsequently approach radar. The initial part of radar training was based upon primary radar only, which meant that you had no aircraft label or altitude readout and had to maintain identification of up to 8 aircraft and correlating each blip to your management of the flight strip board. Very difficult, but again I loved the challenge of it. A huge but necessary equipment replacement program was undertaken in the late 1980s into the 1990s. Up until then, the equipment we were using was completely antiquated and breaking down regularly. The entire lower airspace in Ireland, below flight level 245 and including the Dublin control area, was operating with primary radar only. The equipment was so bad that it was subject to a number of TV current affairs programmes, such as Primetime. And when the ministers etc. were interviewed, the party line was that while the equipment was old, it was doing fine. The union reps at the time contacted the programme makers and disguised the reporter as a spotter, brought him into the centre where he could see and report back what the equipment really was like, obsolete and on its last legs. This re-equipment programme was undertaken in conjunction with the opening of the then new runway 1028 in Dublin and would provide SSR coverage throughout Irish airspace and would provide the towers with a distance from touchdown indicator. The re-equipment programme involved the installation of a green screen, which for the first time had an altitude filter to block out traffic above or below your sector. We still couldn't draw sector boundary maps, and all the labels within your selected altitude were shown, and all labels were bright green, same colour, looked the same, and the only delineation that a label was yours was having a sector number alongside the blip, which on one occasion led to a famous handover. Everything with a 7 on it is yours. The old low-level centre closed and moved over into the Eurocontrol centre, and we also got a ground speed readout, a velocity leader line if wanted, 4 QDMs and short-term conflict alert. The new system also led to the automatic processing of flight plan data and the electronic exchange of information between centres, which was very much welcomed by the planning controllers in the flight data suite. Medium-term conflict detection was still based very much upon the planning controller using the flight progress strips, and as remains to this day, Shannon had responsibility to get westbound oceanic traffic to their oceanic flight level within a plus or minus 2-minute window. At that time, we also assumed control of the Shannon Oceanic Transition Area, whereby a block of oceanic airspace was transferred to us in domestic control. Subsequently, in 2004, we also took over the Northern Oceanic Transition Area off the northwest coast. This change of airspace from oceanic control to domestic control meant that we at Shannon, using radar and direct VHF communications, could reduce separation down to 5 miles in comparison to the 10-minute or 80-mile procedural separation required in the oceanic airspace. As well as being a controller, I was also involved as a staff rep in our union for nearly 10 years. And I must say, I loved working at various times with guys like Brian Joyce, Derek McNamee, Maurice Egan, Tom McGailey, Paul Brennan, Jerry Cahill, Dom Kelly, Paul Walsh and Mick O'Donovan. We formed, I believe, quite a good team, which I feel worked well, and together we challenged one another, and in doing so were able to navigate the Labour Relations Commission and the Labour Court quite successfully. We still work together on pension matters, and I'm sure that this will continue into the future. In the early 2000s, there was a mandate to implement the requirements of the various ESARs on licensing, safety management, occurrence investigation and other matters, and I moved into the safety field. I'd always had an interest in this subject for a number of reasons. As a kid and as a spotter, I remember the Zagreb mid-air collision, as one of the aircraft involved, Golf Alpha Whiskey Zulu Tango, was one of the first aircraft I had logged after it landed on runway 24 at Dublin. I also remember the Tenerife, Pan Am and KLM ground collision. The newspaper and TV pictures and coverage stayed in my mind, and I love getting into the background of how things happened. When we joined the job in 1984, these events of Zagreb in 1976 and Tenerife in 1977, and the subsequent treatment of the controllers, especially in Yugoslavia, were fresh in the minds of our colleagues, and we were handed a union card detailing what you, as a controller, if you were unfortunate enough to be involved in a serious incident, should do. I dipped my toe into the role of safety specialist and occurrence investigator, and a supervisory role also. However, I didn't take to it, or maybe the managers just didn't take to me and my style. We didn't see eye to eye on many matters, and so I walked away from that, returning full-time to the boards as a controller and a coordinator. In 2004, we moved from our centre at the Tower building in the airport to a new centre near Shannon Town, and I must say, I miss being in the airport environment. We implemented a new colour-coded system in the new centre, with a lot of new tools such as route adherence monitoring, cleared level adherence monitoring, and medium-term conflict detection. In time, the use of the flight progress strips was thankfully terminated. In the intervening 21 years, there's been further refinements to this system to turn it into what we currently operate, and in episode 11, I detailed and demonstrated the current system and the available tools. It's well worth a watch. When I joined ATC, the transatlantic routes were dominated by the 747, 707, DC-8, DC-10 and Lockheed TriStar. All 3 or 4 engined aircraft, but also with the 757, 767 and the Airbus A310 coming into production. The Boeing 747 SP was one of the few aircraft that could operate the LAX to Europe routes, and that was taking in around 11 to 12 hours. The evolution of aircraft over the 41 years has been astounding, with flights of 16 or 17 hours being normal operations now, not to mention the Newark to Singapore flight of 18 hours 45 minutes, which crosses our airspace on a regular basis. It's hard to think that having completed a transatlantic crossing from Newark to overhead Shannon, that the flight will be airborne for about another 13 hours after that. The proliferation of twin-engined aircraft and ETOPs has resulted in the decline and near decimation of 3- and 4-engined aircraft. Over the years, engine reliability has resulted in the development of ETOPs operations for twin-engined aircraft and companies. The initial ETOPs allowed for 60 minutes from an en route alternative aircraft, and sometimes when there was very strong winds on the ocean, Shannon would see a number of ETOPs fuel stops to battle the winds. ETOPs then evolved to 120 and then 180 minutes, before moving on the Airbus A350 to 370 minutes from an en route alternate. Nowadays, the transatlantic routes are dominated by twin engines, with the fleet of Boeing 777 and 787 and the Airbus A330 and A350 dominating the wide-body fleets, with only Lufthansa providing passenger services on the 747s. And the Boeing 737 MAX and the Airbus A321neo dominate the narrow-body aircraft across the ocean. The wide-bodies operate at levels way above what used to be used, and up to flight level 430 and Mach 86 is a regular configuration. The MAX and neos operate usually below flight level 350 in a Mach 77 to 79 configuration, and so all parts of the airspace are being well used. The run of north-south sunshine traffic, operated in the main by the A320 and Boeing 737 families, to and from Scotland, Belfast, Northern England and all the Irish airports via Bamba, Tulta and the Tango routes, has grown immensely over the last 10 years, and this adds a huge complexity to the traffic. The first southbound run starts at 6 a.m, and in waves, the north-south flows continue until about 1:30 in the morning. In a lot of ways, I think my career has spanned the best period of the 103 years of ATC so far. I've been lucky to have had the spread of history from the guys who worked the flying boats and Foynes in the 1930s and then transferred up to Shannon. And Mick Manning, here in this photograph, was a supervisor when I joined the job. And Tadgh Murphy also tells the story of the transfer from Foynes to Shannon, or Rineanna as it was in those days.
We were all saying goodbye to Foynes the evening before, and a control officer who was living in Foynes, the late P.J. Flanagan, whispered in a few ears not to bother getting the train or bus into Limerick and then out to Rineanna, around distance of 40 miles, maybe take 2 or 3 hours, whatever, because there was no easy connection here possibly. But he said, I'm taking the launch over in the morning at 9 o'clock or whatever. but keep it to yourself. But of course tongues were loosened during the course of the small hours, and eventually there was fellas whispering in each other's ears, with the result that down the pier the following morning is a horde of fellas with suitcases tied up with binder twine and bicycles. First fella off the launch went up the embankment into the new grill room in Rineanna and shouted in, 57 steak and onions, please.
We had the stories, true or not, of when the original tower went on fire, how the managers were on one side of the building, trying to rescue the attendance books and personnel records, while the workers were on the other side of the building, throwing them all back into the fire. While the equipment on the ground and in the air nowadays is a million miles away from the equipment back then, the basics of the job remain the same. 5 miles or 1,000 feet, keep them apart and help them out if and when they need assistance. The traffic picture that we had to work so hard to develop inside our heads in the non-radar procedural environment may now be presented on the screen in front of you. However, you still have to predict where the traffic and the potential conflicts will be in the coming minutes and take action to resolve the conflicts. Is there anything that I'll miss about the job? I miss the variety that we had when I started out and when we were rated in tower approach and area. You didn't know from 1 hour to the next one where you'd be sitting. I loved tower and approach, sequencing traffic when it was busy, and in the tower visually separating traffic and integrating operations on the cross runway. A lot of disciplines where how the safe end result cannot be written down, but like an apprentice, it must be experienced to become competent. I do still enjoy solving the puzzle of a busy and complex sector, and the airspace from our west coast across to the eastern boundaries, all the way from Nevry to Tadgh, can be very busy and very complex. However, I will not miss being on somebody else's clock, nor will I miss night duties or working weekends, or having to think about what I might be on when any event arises. And my wife has spent the last 12 years juggling our 2 rosters for childcare requirements. Whilst the reorganisation of the published rosters was very much taken on by Tracy, the juggling of 2 rosters does, over the years, take a toll on sleep patterns and family time. So yes, I will miss the puzzle solving, but I don't miss the roster, and in the long run, I'm also a realist. I'm not somebody who thinks that the place won't be able to do without me. It's done without plenty of others in the past, and will continue to do so into the future as many more like me leave. I've had a good run at this stage. I've had some good times with colleagues, especially when we were playing in the Limerick Interfarm and Night Owls leagues. I've been an assistant, a controller, a classroom and simulator instructor, an on-the-job instructor, coordinator, safety specialist, and occurrence investigator and supervisor. However, there's nothing better as a controller than just being able to unplug the headset at the end of the shift and head for home. It was a very busy and complex summer this year, as the rest days and break times were certainly used as rest and recovery time. I've never seen traffic volumes as they have been this year, and the associated traffic complexity was unprecedented. And it's a testament to our controllers of how all this traffic was handled safely. I've enjoyed most of my time in ATC, but over the years there has of course been a number of issues that were very frustrating. But either way, the best thing that happened to me in ATC was that I met my wife there. And so I finished up my final duty on the 17th of September, on a night duty again, and my final sector work was from Shannon and Cork into the Strumble area. And it was kind of appropriate that I shared the sector with Dave Doyle, a guy that I trained 12 years ago. My final exchange as a controller was with Channing 6 Kilo Alpha, a 737-800 out of Edinburgh for Faro.
Shannon Control, good morning, thank you. We are looking at level 3, 0. Shannon 6 Kilo Alpha, Shannon, get AQ radar contact. Hi, Shannon Control, just for information, we've got a Shannon clearance as well, that's no time, so the clearance of 4 miles, level 3, 0, I think 477. Shannon 6 Kilo Alpha, Shannon, that's copy, thanks for that. And as it turns out, at the end of 41 years, you're the last aeroplane I'll be talking to. Good luck on your flight. See you. Bye. Have a good time, and thanks very much.
I'd like to think that I was a good union rep. And on the industrial relations front, we always focused on the big 4 for employment: pay, conditions of service, roster, and pension. Everything else, as far as I'm concerned, is just fluff. I'd like to think that I was a good controller and a decent enough colleague. However, either way, as Oscar Wilde said, some cause happiness wherever they go, others whenever they go. I'll leave it to others to pass their judgment on that.
212, thanks, Shannon, regular contact, and flight heading to flight 4, 4, 1, 674,